Batli Bumboos offers a peculiar lens through which we view the tension between scientific reductionism and aesthetic experience. When Hakim describes a dancer not as an artist in motion, but as the movements of calcium, protein, and fat, he's not just making a joke, he's poking at a fundamental philosophical divide. According to Mustafa Sajjad Haider, who crafted these satirical dialogues, this character embodies the grumpiness and pseudo-wisdom of a traditional healer, yet his observation about the calcium and fat dancer mirrors a very real critique of how science can sometimes strip the soul out of art. If a scientist stood up in the middle of a performance and declared that the audience was merely witnessing biological mechanics, they wouldn't be hailed as a genius. They would be seen as a nuisance who ruined the magic. This brings us to a deep question about whether the truth of a thing, its chemical composition or biological structure, is actually the most important thing about it.
It's a fascinating paradox because in reality, no scientist is actually out there trying to ruin dance recitals by shouting about macronutrients. But the fear that science might do that it might reduce human emotion and beauty to mere data, is a very old one. In the field of philosophy, this is often called eliminative materialism or scientific reductionism. It's the idea that mental states, like the feeling of being moved by a dance, are just fancy labels for physical processes. If you look at research in the journal Nature or studies on neuroaesthetics, there is an effort to map out exactly why we find certain movements beautiful. They look at things like motor empathy, where our brains mirror the movements of the dancer. While that's technically true, Hakim's point is that the truth is socially and contextually dependent. A dancer is a dancer because of the culture, the rhythm, and the emotion, not just because her bones are made of calcium.
That term motor empathy is a great example of the very thing Hakim is mocking. We take a visceral, heart-pounding experience and give it a clinical name that sounds like a car engine part. The humor in the dialogue comes from the extreme absurdity of the Hakim's student, who praises him for bringing a distant pearl of wisdom, only for the Hakim to reply that he makes the student sit far away just so his words seem distant and profound. It's a critique of how authority figures use complex language to maintain power. But I wonder, is Hakim actually attacking scientists, or is he attacking the way we use rational explanations to kill joy? The user who shared this text felt a bit defensive, wondering if this was a smear campaign against scientists. But when you look at the history of South Asian satire, like the work of Mushtaq Ahmad Yusufi, the Hakim character is usually a vehicle to mock anyone who is too rigid in their thinking, whether that's a doctor, a priest, or a bureaucrat.
Exactly. The Hakim isn't necessarily a proxy for a lab scientist. He's a proxy for the know-it-all who misses the forest for the trees. In the context of the calcium and protein dancer, he's highlighting a category error. If you describe a painting by the chemical weight of the pigments, you aren't wrong, but you've missed the painting entirely. There's a famous philosophical argument by Mary Midgley where she compares the world to a giant aquarium. You can look at it from the top, the side, or the bottom. Each view gives you a different map, and none of them is the only true one. The scientific view of the dancer as calcium and protein is one map. The artist's view of the dancer as a story in motion is another. The problem arises when someone claims their map is the only one that matters. Hakim is saying that if you try to replace the story with the chemical map during a performance, the audience will, rightfully, want to drag you out of the hall.
The phrase he uses, gasita gasati, or being dragged away for causing an interruption, really captures that social contract. We agree to enter a state of suspension of disbelief when we watch art. We know the dancer is made of cells and atoms, but we choose to see the soul. When the Hakim suggests that pointing out the calcium would be met with hostility, he's identifying a social boundary. But let's play devil's advocate for a second. Isn't there something valuable in knowing the calcium side of it? For instance, sports science and nutrition studies, like those published in the Journal of Dance Medicine and Science, show that understanding a dancer's calcium and protein intake is actually what allows them to perform those movements in the first place. Without the literal calcium, there is no dance. So is the Hakim being a bit hypocritical? He's a healer after all. He should care about the calcium.
That is the irony of the character. Hakeem Batli Bumbuz is a practitioner of Hikmat, traditional medicine, which is all about the balance of elements. He should be the first person to appreciate the biological necessity of these things. But the satire lies in his delivery. He's using his knowledge not to help the dancer, but to mock the audience's wonder. There's a psychological concept called unweaving the rainbow, a phrase famously used by the poet John Keats. He accused Isaac Newton of destroying the beauty of the rainbow by explaining how it's just light refracting through prisms. Richard Dawkins later wrote a book with the same title, arguing that understanding the science actually makes the rainbow more beautiful, not less. But Hakeem isn't arguing for a deeper beauty. He's using the facts as a weapon to ruin the fun. It's a classic power move. He's showing his disciple that he can deconstruct anything, even a moment of pure bliss, into something mundane and oily.
That power dynamic between the Hakeem and the student is so telling. The student is constantly in awe, calling him Chibla and Hazrat, while the Hakeem is just being a cynical old man. When the student says, "You always bring a pearl from far away," and the Hakeem says, "I sit you far away, so it seems that way," it's a direct admission that his wisdom is a performance. It's about the optics of expertise. If we apply this to the scientist question, maybe the critique isn't of science itself, but of the arrogance that sometimes comes with it, the idea that the scientific explanation is the only grown-up way to see the world, and everything else is just imagination or fat and protein. It's the condescension that the audience is reacting to in his hypothetical scenario.
It's also worth looking at the specific substances he picks: calcium, protein, and fat. He didn't say atoms or quarks. He picked the things associated with the body, with flesh. By calling the dancer's movements the fluctuations of fat, he's being intentionally crude. He's trying to strip away the grace of the performance and replace it with the heaviness of the physical body. In the history of aesthetics, there's always been a struggle with the fact that art is produced by a physical, sometimes gross human body. A singer has saliva and vocal cords. A dancer has sweat and fat. Most art tries to make us forget that. Hakeem is the guy who points at the sweat and says, "See? Just biological waste." It's a form of nihilism masquerading as insight.
Which explains why the user felt like it was a smear campaign against scientists. If you identify as someone who values facts and evidence, hearing your worldview used as a tool to ruin a dance performance feels like a personal attack. But the Hakeem is a quack character. The name Batli Bumbuz sounds like gibberish. Batli means bottle, and Bumbuz is just a rhythmic, nonsensical suffix. He isn't a real scientist, he's a caricature of a pedant. The real science isn't what he's doing. Real science, like the work being done at the Max Planck Institute for Empirical Aesthetics, actually respects the mystery of why we like dance. They don't say it's just fat. They ask, how does the arrangement of fat and muscle create a signal that the human brain interprets as grace?
Exactly. The how and why are not the same thing. Science explains the how the muscles contract, how the calcium ions trigger the movement. But the why it moves us to tears, is the domain of the humanities and the arts. Hakeem's error, and the reason he'd get dragged out, is that he tries to answer the why with a how. It's like someone asking why you love your mother and you answering with a list of shared DNA percentages. It's factually correct, but it's a total failure of human communication. The satire here is exposing the absurdity of living life only through the lens of physical reductionism. Even the student's reaction is satirical. He is so well trained in his subservience that he finds wisdom even in his master's insults.
The student's Darye Hayrat, or River of Wonder, is such a poetic way to describe being confused by a master's nonsense. It reminds me of the Socratic method gone wrong. Instead of leading the student to truth, the Hakeem is leading him into a fog. And the user's reaction, sitting in the sun to dry off after drowning in that river of wonder, is a perfect metaphor for reclaiming common sense. Sometimes after a long debate about the nature of reality or the materialist versus idealist views of art, you just have to go back into the hall and watch the dance. You have to accept that the dancer is both calcium and soul simultaneously. You don't have to pick a side.
That's the ultimate takeaway. The Hakeem wants you to pick a side. He wants you to see the fat so you can't see the dance. He's a disruptor. But the real wisdom, which the student misses and the Hakim ignores, is that the fat is the medium through which the beauty is expressed. In architecture, we don't say a cathedral is just bricks. We know the bricks are essential, but the cathedral is the space between the bricks, the light through the windows, the way it makes you feel small. Hakim is a brick counter. And while brick counting is a necessary job for a builder, it's a terrible way to experience a mass.
It's a warning against the coldness of a purely analytical life. If you spend your whole life analyzing the mahiyat, or essence of things in a laboratory sense, you might lose the ability to be mabut, to be stunned or mesmerized. The spectators in Hakim's story are mabut because they are seeing the whole, not the parts. The Hakim is the only one not mesmerized, which he thinks makes him superior. But in reality, it just makes him lonely. He's sitting in a room full of magic, and all he sees is a list of ingredients.
It's a very cynical form of enlightenment. He thinks he's seeing through the illusion, but he's actually just missing the point of the human experience. If everything is just calcium, protein, and fat, then nothing has meaning. But we know that isn't true because the audience's reaction, their kundat or anger at the interruption, proves that the meaning is real to them. The social reality of the dance is just as factual as the biological reality of the body. One doesn't cancel out the other.
So, to our listener who felt this was a campaign against scientists, maybe see it instead as a campaign against the misuse of science. It's a critique of the person who uses a thermometer to describe a summer day. The temperature is a fact, but summer is a feeling. Don't let the thermometer tell you the feeling isn't real. Hakim Batli Bamboos is a reminder to keep the pearls and the distance in perspective. Sometimes the most profound thing you can do is just stay quiet and watch the dance.
And perhaps the greatest irony of all is that the Hakim himself is a creation of art. Mustafa Sajjad Haider used words, not chemicals, to create this character who complains about the movements of fat. The very existence of the satire proves that there is something more to us than just biological mechanics. We are creatures who tell stories about why we aren't just creatures.
It's a beautiful, messy loop of logic that leaves us exactly where we started. In the audience, watching the dancer, perfectly happy to forget about the calcium for a while. If this exploration of the tension between science and art sparked a new perspective for you, consider sharing this conversation with a friend who appreciates a good debate.